Okay, so first off, let's answer this question here. What happens when you load up a website? Because that's the first thing that people don't really know too well. They type in search terms in Google, they type in domain names in the search bar, but what actually happens when you load up a website? So to answer this, what we need to know is how does the internet work, basically. So the client-server model is the most basic explanation of what the internet is. It's just a connection, a network that bridges between servers and clients, both of which are computers. They're all computers, but they are servers and clients. And you can see a diagram of this is what it kind of represents. You have one server containing information, containing websites, containing files that make up websites, containing databases with data, and this is what a server farm would look like. It's just a huge place full of computers that just work all day processing data and processing requests from these clients. Clients being other computers used by you and me that we can call up websites from. And that's what the internet basically is. It's just the connection between one computer to another, and the sharing of data and the requesting and responding of data back and forth. And it's all made up of computers. This server farm is made up of computers. This is a computer. This is a client computer. This is a server computer. They're all computers. They're just they're the same basic thing, but they do different jobs and they're connected, and together they make up the World Wide Web. So this is a slightly more in detailed explanation of how it actually works when you load up a website. So the first thing that happens when you just type in a domain name in the URL, this is kind of just, it's not too important to know, but it's quite interesting. So you just, when you put just a domain name like this, turnonvpn.org, it's going to send that request to something called a DNS server, called a domain name system server. And there are not that many of these servers, although they have the same kind of function as a server that we saw here. This could be a DNS server, it could not be. They're all computers. But they have a different function. The function of a DNS server is to connect up the IP address to a domain name, because each domain name, and a domain name just means the name of a website that will start with something like www and will end with .org or .com or .net. That's a domain name. And each domain name, when someone buys a domain name, will have an IP address. And that IP address corresponds to some server somewhere that has that specific IP address with the files of the website on it. But the DNS server isn't involved with that. The DNS server just has a huge list of all the domain names of a certain region, and then a huge list of all the corresponding IP addresses. So the first thing that you do, you type in the domain name, it will send a request to a DNS server, and the DNS server will reply with the IP address corresponding to the domain name that you put in. And then the browser will now interpret that IP address, and then make an HTTP request, a hypertext transfer protocol request, to the server of that specific IP address. And which is just this long number that you might have seen before, these long numbers with periods in the middle. That's just an IP address. And then the server will reply with all the needed files so that the website can render out onto the screen, and then the user can use it. And then when the user puts in some information into the site, it will make another HTTP request down to the server, and it will put data into this server itself, into the database. So it's just this back and forth of HTTP requests and responses between the server with all the files of the website that we're going to be learning how to make, that are stored on this specific IP address server, somewhere in a big server farm, exactly like what we saw earlier. These servers are stored, just one of these little stacks here, that's a server. And you send this HTTP request to there, and then that will reply. And you might be wondering why you have the DNS server if this seems to be working so well. And that's because machines are just much better at interpreting numbers than names and words. So that's why it's needed to have an IP address, an Internet Protocol address, instead of just a name, because machines wouldn't be able to recognize so fast domain names and calculate them as easily as a number. So, for example, Twitter, which you probably know about, the website twitter.com, this is one of the IP addresses it has. Obviously, Twitter is a huge website, so it has more than one server, but this is one of them. So if you look up for this IP address here, you should get twitter.com coming back in the same exact way that you would do it for any other website. So here is just a chronological order of what would happen when you actually load up a website. So this is just what we said. So the user types in a URL, including the domain name, so such as twitter.com. The browser sends a request to the DNS server, and it's called a DNS lookup, domain name system lookup. Then the DNS server will respond with that IP address corresponding to the website in question. And then the browser will send an HTTP request to that to the server with that IP address, and then they will go back and forth with HTTP requests to do whatever the user wants to do on that site. But the first HTTP request is going to just send the files that are needed to render out the site on the browser. And then the browser interprets all those files, the HTML, the CSS, the styling, all the interactive stuff, and it renders it out. Exactly like here, I'm on Google Drive here. Google Drive is a website, and I did exactly what all of these steps here. So then the website is rendered out on my computer. Okay, so that's the basis of how the internet works. But now you might be wondering the actual components of a website itself, because if you remember what I told you, the first HTTP request is from this server here, the server with the specific IP address, and that's the first HTTP response, sending back the files, and the files are just the components of a website. So you can see this diagram here to explain. It's quite a complicated, weird diagram, but it explains it quite well, what makes up a website. And you can see that there are two main sections in this diagram, the client side and the server side. And if you remember, I was talking earlier about the client-server model. This is exactly what it is. This is what the internet is. On the server, you have these elements of a website, and on the client, you have these elements of the website. So on the client side, you have the HTML, so the actual content of the site. Then you have the CSS, the styling of the site, what makes it look good. Then the JS, the JavaScript, and that's what allows users to interact with the site in a cool way. So those are all the files that get sent to the client from the server, from the web server. And then on the server side, you have a different stack of elements. You have the web server itself, and that's the server that just contains all the different files in a certain location on the computer that is the server. And it has a specific IP address so that the client can find it. Then you have the backend language, and the backend language will talk between the database and the server, so that then the server can take elements from the database, can take data from the database and display it on the client, and the client can then interact with the database through this backend language. So let's say a user can put in a username in the client side, the backend language will interpret that username and store it in the database. And then we get to the database, and that's one of the most important parts on a website. That's where all the data is stored. And all of these three things are stored in one of those big computers that you saw earlier in the server farm. While these elements here, these are sent to the client computer, just a small laptop or a desktop just owned by someone like you or me. And that's how it works. That's how a website works. And then around here you can see all the different technologies that people use to make their lives easier. And so you can see all the different types of databases that you can have, MySQL, Redis, all these different things, different backend languages, and all these different little libraries. So if you want to know, I'm gonna teach you how to use mainly PHP as the backend language, MySQL as the database, Apache as the web server, and then jQuery for JavaScript, and we won't worry about Bootstrap for HTML and CSS. So those are the libraries that we're going to use if you want to note those down. But really, the more and more you learn about this stuff, the more you realize that the technology that you use does not matter. It's more about just the thinking process and getting your mind around how to solve problems while making a site. So once you understand how it works, the technology really doesn't matter. Okay, so here's an example of a very, very simple yet full stack application. So what you do here is just you can change a password, and then it will display that password right here, but with an @ in front of it. So we can try it. We can put Mary and submit that, and it will change the password to Mary. So this is very simple. It's completely useless, but it can give you an idea of how a full stack website can work. So I can show you the code that actually makes up this website. And I know that you're probably new to this, so it might be a bit confusing, but just to give you an intro. I talked about client side and server side in the earlier section, and here you can see the client side code here, which is the HTML, and then up here you can see the server side. And you might be confused because I said that they're very separate, and that's true. But then why are they in the same file? And that's quite a confusing concept to understand. But actually, when someone calls up this website, like I'm doing here in the URL, actually the server will only reply with this. It will only reply with the HTML, and this will only be working on the server. It's not going to call up all this text here, because that's useless to the user. This is the actual content of the site that is important, and this just does the contacting to the database. But let me explain what this code actually does. So here we have the content of the site. So here I'm specifying that we have a little box that says username, as you can see here, and then a little box here that will give the output. And you can see that here I'm using a server-side script to say which username the user has put in. And then here we have a form, so where the user can input some information, which is right here, where I can change the username. And that's specified by a HTML form. And then we have a few input fields, one being the submit and one being the actual place where you put in the text. So this all happens on the client side, but if you just were to write this without any styling, I can show you what that would look like if I just misspell the name of the style sheet. You see, it would just look like that. And that looks horrible. Nobody's gonna want to go into this site more than once. Although it would perfectly well work. I mean, if I put Jack, you see, it will show Jack. But it's just not gonna be very user-friendly. So what I have to do is style the site. And to style a site, as I said earlier, you have to add some CSS code, which means cascading style sheet. And this right here is a cascading style sheet. And this, all it does is basically just tell the HTML to arrange itself in a way that is friendly. And the developer, the designer, in fact, has to code this CSS so that it does a good job to do that. So I can reload it here, and you can see, and this is the result. So here, what exactly I'm doing is centering it with this section here. You're going to learn all about all these methods here. But you can see how the syntax works. You're selecting an element, like a div tag, as I've specified here. And then I just call these HTML elements, and I tell them what to do. So I say, you have to space yourself from the top by 50%, and space yourself from the left by 50%, and then the background color, height, all those things. And then I can specify fonts, so Courier New, that's the font there. And I can specify fonts of the placeholder inside the input field. I can specify the width. I can design the button. If you see I hover over the button, then it's going to change, and that makes it a bit interactive for the user, and that's good. And you can specify that by using this little hover. You're going to learn, as I say, all of this later, but you understand how this works now. And for this to actually have an impact to the HTML, because if you just put it in the same folder as I have here, I put these two files in the same folder, simple site and simple site style. But if I just put them in the same folder, it won't do anything. You actually have to link it. And that's one of the things that you do in the HTML header, the head. So you just say that you link to this HTML page a style sheet, and you specify what that style sheet is. And then that just means that the HTML is going to call it, and then CSS will work on the HTML and styling it so that it looks good. Then up here we have the server-side code, and this is what in a professional website environment would be done by the back-end developers, because this actually works on the server side. As I said, the server is where the website is kept, and the user calls it from the server. So this code all stays on the server. It doesn't get called up as this, because when the user types in the URL, this will be brought to the browser. In fact, I can show you if I inspect the page here, you can see the source code. And this source code here, in fact, is identical to what I've written here, as you can see. So HTML, the head, it's all exactly the same. And because that's what's called up to the browser. While this code here, you can't see it. However, in this little section here where I'm saying that the PHP can echo a value, then it will show, because echoing means that it will be called by the client when the client calls the website. But the actual text here is not going to be called, because this is just functions on the server. That's just very important to understand. But what does this PHP do? Because this is PHP, as I say, and you can see that it's PHP there. And basically what it's doing is it's just taking the value that the user puts into the input here, and it checks if it's set. It checks if it's empty, because if it's empty you don't want the user to put in an empty username. Let's say if this is a real website. And then it talks to the database that I have in this computer, in my computer here, and it will exchange information. So it will say, okay, so the user's put in this value, I'm going to send it to you and you store it. And then here in the selection it will say, hey, remember that username? I'm gonna call it back from you. So it will take it from the database and then make it into another value here. And then that value here is echoed by the server onto the client side, so then we can see it. So that's what happens. You put in the input, you send the input over HTTP to the server, because remember that this is all server-side code, this is client-side, so that there needs to be an HTTP request between the two parts of the website. It's not just as easy as communicating between one side, like in the client side or server side. So when you click submit, you're sending an HTTP request to the server, and in my case I have this site on localhost, and local just means that I have the server and the client on the same computer, and that's what all developers do. They're not going to put their site online and then have it in another server and then call it every time they need to do an HTTP request, because that's very time consuming and quite expensive. So they just have both the server and the client on the same computer. I'll teach you how to set up a server in your computer. It's very easy. So then you can do this too. But for now I have localhost set up here. But that doesn't take away from the fact that I have to make a HTTP request to the server. Even though it's located in the computer, they're located in different places, and the communication between them is still an HTTP request. So yeah, so that's what happens when you click submit. You're sending an HTTP request to the server, and then the server here will talk to the database and will put in the username that you typed in, and then reselect it out and then display it right here after an @ so that, as in many social media will have an @ before the username. Here I specify that you put an @ in front of it. And so it's by every definition a full stack application. And to understand that a little bit clearer, I'll just show you the database. So here this is a very, very simple database, and this is read by a program on the browser. You can actually see the database in other ways on the computer, because all it is just a file stored in the computer that is all coded and encrypted so that people can't access it, and it's hidden very deep into the computer. But here it can be read. So this is what a database looks like, and this is incredibly simple because the username is very simple. But if I reload this page, because there I've got username W, you'll see that the username is Jack. If I change this to Mary, submit, and I reload this, you'll see that the username is Mary. And that's all done by this PHP. That's why PHP is so important, and it's the backend language. That's why the backend language is so important, because the backend language here is saying update username, set username. That's saying to the database set the username to this value being uname, and uname being the value that is being taken from here, from this input field right here, called username. So then the post basically receives the HTTP request from that, saves it as this variable, uname, and then in this function here, this MySQL function here, you bind it to the function and it will communicate to the server. And then here, it will reselect it back, put it into another variable, and display it here. And I've been using the word variable. I say this often, but you're going to learn this later as well. But variable is basically, maybe if you know algebra, x and y, those are variables because they can have different values. And uname selected just means a variable. And in PHP, they're defined by the $sign. And you can give them different values, but they have a specific name to represent that value. And here, it just binds that variable to the value that is taken when you're selecting the username from the database. And then that's displayed right here in front of the ad. So this is a complete full stack application. We can try it again. Let's put Tom. Submit. And you can see here that the username is changed. And here, this database might be a bit confusing because it seems very simple. It's just, one term. And you could say, why bother? You could do this in many ways just to display it. But I'll show you a slightly more complicated table, which is what it would look like normally. This is a table of a few US states and their populations. So here you can see they have different columns. So this is a column of the ID that I gave it, then the column of the states, names of the states, and then the populations. So this is what a table will normally look a bit more like. Because then the PHP can talk to the server and say, hey, send me the population of the state that has the name Alabama, and it will return that number right there. Or give me the ID of the state that has 3,303 population, and then it will give you 3. So normally databases are used more that way than just putting one value in. And I'll show you the database of something more like a social media site. These are all fake users, but this is what something like Twitter or Facebook is going to have in their huge data centers. They're just going to have a huge database with information a bit like this. So they're going to have, IDs, emails, usernames, full names, hashed passwords, all put in this very, very neat table that then the PHP can access exactly in the way that this works. So I hope you understand this, because once you understand this, then all of web development is at your fingertips, because there's not much else. Now, obviously this is just touching the surface. HTML and all these languages are incredibly complex and deep, but this is really the basis of how it all works.